Next, I would like to welcome Helen and Olivia to do the next presentation.
So we're going to try to go quickly, and at the same time, we can't surpass at all Dr. Oduro's excellent presentation. So what Olivia and I would like to do is just highlight the difference that this project is making in the lives of resource-poor women and men and young people, and identify some of the dimensions of this project that are still quite important from a perspective of gender and socioeconomic analysis. Yeah. So, do you want to do that?
You can start.
Okay. So we did have some questions to start off. Often what people will say to me is are technologies like agroforestry really appropriate for women? Are women making the most of these technologies? And how do we know that it's making a change in their lives? And a lot of the change that we're going to talk about in this presentation today really has to do with building capacity at different levels of women, but also men's lives. So men are not left out of the equation when we talk about gender equality. The project itself has been able to facilitate a number of gender studies. I got involved with this project right from the very beginning, and one of the things that I'm very proud of is that gender came up in the very first meeting. I didn't have to wait for several meetings and then put on my gender hat and say, okay, what about the women? What about the men? Relationships with women around resources. And from the very first day, we had a very constructive attitude around issues of gender equality. And it's grown into a number of different studies. You can see the titles of some of the pieces of work that Masters of Science students here at the University of Guelph have done. And we also have fairly extensive data dating back to the beginning of the project from the baseline study, and we continue to do gender analysis so that we have longitudinal or change over time picture of what's happening at the household level. We can see a number of reasons why agroforestry could be appropriate for women's lives. Number one, as many of you are well aware, women are the farmers of sub-Saharan Africa. They do most of the day-to-day agricultural labor. There's opportunities for women managing what we call micro livestock, and Katie Cancella, one of our Masters of Science students, will talk about micro livestock shortly. But it includes livestock that Canadians don't often think about, like the giant African snail at the top of the picture in my hand there. And we also know that agroforestry has potential to take opportunities or create opportunities for markets activity for women. Ghana is a very interesting context for this type of work because Ghana has a history of having market queens, so women who are very strong in the market, who are very sure of their business skills. But in this particular area of Ghana, there are a lot of challenges to women to be involved in the market economy, and a lot of it will come down to sort of individual entrepreneurship and autonomy to make the investments and take the risk to be involved in the market. So we see many gender gaps and differences in the lives of women and men in relationship to agroforestry that have to be taken into account. In fact, we've come down to 4 variables where gender is absolutely critical: land, labor, capital, and knowledge. At each of these variables in the analysis, we know that gender has to be taken into account. So for instance, we know that planting a tree on a piece of land implies a proprietary right. When a woman plants a tree, she's making a claim that this is her land. And she's not just saying that to men in her family, she's saying that to her community as well. That is a big step in women's lives and should never be taken lightly. The same thing with labor. When you see this kind of data collected by one of our master's students on the difference of the work in a woman's life versus a man, we can look at how and why women are involved in certain tasks in the agroforestry system, why involving them right from the beginning is so important, and why not leaving men out is equally important. We need to work with men as well as women, and we need to see that they have a different type of role and responsibility in the system. We know that the project has made a big difference in putting cash in people's pockets. But as we know in the field of gender and agriculture, sometimes cash in women's pockets goes to pay for children's education and other activities that women prioritize in their life. So they're responsible for a number of investments in the family. And whereas the capital that's available to invest back into the farm, the women might ask the men, you invest in the farm, and the men may say, no, you invest in the farm. So capital for women is especially important. So any type of opportunity to increase income is tremendously important. The early data shows us that, in fact, the annual incomes are around 203 Ghana cedis, very low, extremely low. And we were quite shocked to see this across a number of the villages. So these were quite impoverished communities. The project's also taken the concept of gender and made sure that we don't talk just about adult women and men, but we talk about young girls and boys, and how starting young to talk about issues around equality are very important. You know very well that in schools there is a pecking order between male students and female students. Often one of the cases that we have documented through one of the studies is that women don't want, or young girls don't want to see themselves go into agriculture as a career. They see their mothers doing it, they look down upon it. Young men often feel that too, although men like the business side of agriculture very much. So working with young girls to talk about their opportunities in agricultural science, in agricultural education is tremendously important. And the same thing with recognizing girls who leave school. Girls are 3 times more likely to leave primary and 6 times more likely to leave secondary school in Ghana. And so this one picture up here on the side of a girl receiving a certificate, she was a school leaver, she's receiving a certificate for agroforestry from the youth club, is a tremendous way of mentoring young girls and bringing them into a new type of opportunity for their future. And finally, my final slide before I pass over to Olivia to talk about some of the details is that the approach that we're using for capacity development is tremendously important for gender. We can put women through all the kinds of training that you want. You can train them in X, Y, and Z. But if we don't change the system in which women live, there will be very little difference at the end of the day. We also recognize in this area, we call it a low context culture. Organizations, joining farmers organizations and building producers associations is almost impossible. This is an area we've found over the years that people act individually. They act in their own interest. They don't trust and they don't work in communal groups. So that's very different from areas of sub-Saharan Africa where I've worked, where women's groups are very active. So building that middle level, that meso level of networks, social networks, and organizations is tremendously important. And then finally, we've got to change attitudes at the top of the system. We have to build universities, ministries of agriculture that are really conscious of the fact that gender is not a fad, that it is important to mainstream it right across the system. Okay. So I'll pass over to Olivia.
So I'll continue where Helen stopped. We have tried to look at livelihood planning. It's been a whole process. And as Helen said, people look at things on an individual level. So when we're looking at livelihood planning, it was very important to look at it as a means to an end. And what's that? Poverty. And this approach had 3 main steps. And you'll be surprised at the approach we used. It's something that we normally take for granted. And we did that because we realized that, one, we're focusing on gender, not just the women, but again, it's the men, because you need the men to work with the women to get things going. So we realized that they were very limited in their record keeping, especially for expenditure, and also for revenues. And we need those as indicators of whether the project is really making an impact. And as Professor Drew has presented to us, it has happened. But how did it happen? We had something called the cooking concept. And it was one of our colleagues, Lucy, she brought it up. We were dealing with women. We want to involve more women in the project. And women always cook. It's part of us. So what she thought of is that when you're cooking, what do you do? What are the processes that go in your mind before you cook? Even if you're not a man, you would eat and you would make a request for a meal. And the woman has to think of how to prepare that meal. So that was the basis for the livelihood planning that we looked at. So we took what women knew already, what they were working with, and then we turned it around to get them into livelihood planning. We wanted to really see what they were doing and then work with it. So we started by putting them into a workshop. We said, you're going to prepare a meal. And if you're Ghanaian and you eat fufu, you know that fufu requires some ingredients, some tools. Because if you cook all your cassava, your plantain, and you don't have your mortar and your pestle, you can't make the meal. So we got the women thinking that things they normally take for granted, let's translate them into a livelihood plan. And that is how we got the women involved. We got the men interested as well. And surprisingly, even the men thought that, oh yes, the women make the meals, but we haven't thought about the things that go into making a meal. So that was the basis for the concept of the cooking concept translated into livelihood planning. So what came out of it was that we had the women being able to conceptualize and plan a livelihood. So for example, we have this woman here, and her name is Sarah. She's part of the project participants. She wanted to go into sheep rearing, so she had to think about what she needed. So looking at the cooking concept, cooking, what do you need to make a meal? She translated that into preparing a livelihood. The focus here was how much she has to put into the activity and how much has to come out of the activity. So quickly you can see that she plans to put in 401 Ghana cedis, and looking at all the expenses, eventually she'll make 669 Ghana cedis, which is a lot of money for an individual. So that was how we use the cooking concept. So quickly following that, we now have them very interested in these activities, and we've mentioned this already, so I just quickly run through. But the take home is that we use a concept that is generally accepted, taken for granted, and translated into part of the project, which really worked for us. It really worked very well. And we have them, the guide process that you saw, the group was formed initially before they started producing. And as Helen pointed out, normally they want to work as individuals. So getting them to come together as a group like this was a very good success story for the project, because you hardly ever get people wanting to work in a group. They're always thinking of, if I work, there's this free rider things come in. They just want to get along with the bandwagon. But we got them to a group, and we even had group leaders, and they were working together. We also realized that for women especially, there's a problem with access to knowledge. That came out clearly in the project. And when we started the workshops, we'll start and then we'll see that we had more men participating than the women. And it was all about the household chores and other activities. But with knowledge passing around, we've got to change around. And now if you look at the statistics we have more women taking part in the projects than the men, which is very good for us. And again, we have 3 communities, and they're very peculiar in their issues of land, labor, and capital. I'll just focus on the last community, Fiapre. Fiapre is becoming highly urbanized because now there's a Catholic university. And we had one participant, she was very active, but suddenly she realized that if she turns into a landlord, it is more profitable than staying in agroforestry. So that is a challenge we have. But again, the good thing about agroforestry is that you don't need vast land to practice agroforestry. You can still practice agroforestry on a very small, limited land. So we are still trying to get that done. But what we need to remember is that there are serious challenges with land, especially ownership, and especially if you're a woman. Because one, we have a proverb that even if a woman buys a gun, it's the man who keeps it. So it means that we still have to be controlled. Women have access, but the men have the control. So we are still working on that, and we know that we'll make some progress. And again, when it comes to incentives to engage in agroforestry, we still need to put in some more effort in getting that done. As I mentioned earlier on, this particular one was very entrepreneurial, but because of the changes that are going on, which they indirectly affect the issues because it is external to the project, but they still have an impact on what we're doing. But again, with educational experience, we can get things done. And again, we do not want this project to die at the end of it. So we are really looking at sustainability. So as we go along, we have tried, especially with the gender, because gender, people misunderstand gender, but it's not women, it's all of us together. So we have tried to take the students in the faculty, especially the first years who have just come in, we take them through some gender analysis tools so they understand them. And then we send them out to try and apply what they have, especially the first years and the final years. The final years because they are going out to work so they can get the opportunity to apply it. And then within, amongst ourselves, the staff, we also need the training. So we take ourselves through that training. It is to build sustainability. We don't want a case where the project ends and everything stops. No, we don't want that. So where are we going with all this? Where we are going is that, one, we want to continue identifying gender gaps and trying to manage those gender gaps. We have started, but we still have a lot to do. So we still need support. And again, we have to market the benefits of agroforestry. That's also very important because we tend to take them for granted, thinking that we know what is the benefits from it. But we need to really demonstrate that agroforestry, it pays. It is profitable, and that is something that the project is trying. That is why now we have some communities wanting to come in. And mainstreaming gender in agroforestry policy is a big thing we really want to achieve. Because once we get it mainstream, it becomes part and parcel of the whole policy of the nation. So they recognize that you are looking at men's needs, experiences, women's needs, experience, and they integrate them for the good of the greater society. Once we get that done, we have no problem. So we are still in that process. And we still have to continue getting increasing their knowledge on inheritance and land rights. It's very important. Because I say the Ghanaians behave like an ostrich sometimes. We put our head in the sand, thinking that everything's all right, but it's not. Women still have some problems when it comes to land. And finally, we need to continue with the collaboration between KNUST and University of Guelph. We are not ending it after 2013. We are going to continue because we need to really support mainstreaming. I will say for the whole of Ghana, because if Ghana wants to move forward, we need to really mainstream gender. Thank you very much.